Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Now we are reaching the end of the tales of King Arthur and his knights. But even though today's selections end with the passing of King Arthur, you can find many more tales of chivalry and bravery, and even other legends of King Arthur in the public library. Today we will hear about the beautiful and loving maiden of Astolat, and what she does for Sir Lancelot. Then in the final tale, King Arthur is getting very old and tired, but he has one final thing to do, involving the sword Excalibur. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. King Arthur and his Knights. The Maid of Astolat. Now it chanced that as Lady Day approached, King Arthur resolved to call a great tournament at Camelot. He announced that he and the King of the Scots would meet all comers in a great mock battle. Hastily the best and most valiant knights in all Britain, and even from beyond the sea, began to gather. Some took the side against Arthur with the King of Northumberland, and he who was known as the King with 100 knights as their leaders, while in Arthur's party were King Anguish of Ireland, and many of the best knights of the Round Table. Lancelot withheld his promise to take part, pleading in excuse that he had not yet recovered from a wound. In due time the king and his friends set out for Camelot, and presently Lancelot followed, unknown to Arthur. In the upper reaches of the Thames, and at no great distance from the river, was the little town of Astolat, and above the town rose the towers of the castle of old Baron Bernard. There dwelt the worthy old knight with his 2 sons, Sir Tira and Sir Lavaine, both but lately made knights, and his fair daughter Elaine. It was in the early evening when the king, riding toward Camelot, came upon the grey towers of Bernard's castle, ruddy with the last rays of the setting sun, rising above the little town that nestled about the base of the hill. The fast approaching darkness and the dusk of the tree-sheltered valley road warned the king that he must seek shelter for the night, so his party spurred their way up the steep approach to the castle, where they were met with a hearty welcome by the hospitable old knight and his household. Not long after Arthur's arrival, another guest rode up to the great gate. He was alone, but all were welcome at Astolat, and he too was received most courteously. As he rode through the courtyard, Arthur spied him and recognized Sir Lancelot. "I have just seen a knight who will meet us in the coming tournament," said the king to his knights, "and I warrant he will do marvels." "Who is it?" asked his followers. "I shall not tell you yet," replied Arthur with a smile, as he went to his chamber, but he secretly resolved that Gawain should not enter the lists, for whenever he and Lancelot met, Gawain was worsted. Meanwhile the kind old baron led Lancelot to the great hall and gave him courteous welcome. But he knew not that his guest was the great Lancelot. "Fair sir," said Lancelot, "I would pray you lend me a shield that is not well known for the coming jousts, for mine is well known, and I would joust disguised." "That will I do gladly," said his host. "My elder son was hurt the day he was made knight, so badly indeed that he cannot ride. His shield is unknown anywhere but here, and you shall have that. And I too would pray a favour of you. My younger son here, Sir Lavaine, is a likely and strong youth, eager for adventure. I would gladly have him ride to the jousts with so noble a knight as you appear to be, I do not yet know your name." "Right gladly would I have your son go with me," responded Lancelot heartily. "But I must ask you to forgive me if I do not tell you my name at this time. If all goes well at the tournament, I shall come back to you, and then you shall know who I am. Think me not discourteous, gentle knight, for there are reasons why I must remain unknown." Then Sir Bernard turned to his daughter, who all this time had been standing near, her eyes fixed in admiration on the handsome strange knight. "Go, daughter, and bring your brother's shield," said he. Presently she returned with the shield, and Lancelot handed his own to her. "Keep this shield until I come again," he said kindly. She took it like a precious thing, and little did the valiant knight dream how all the long hours he was away she would treasure it in her chamber, and muse over it and dream upon it. Yes, and press it close in her arms and kiss it, because it was his. As she took the shield from him, she shyly asked if he would wear at the jousts a token of hers. "Fair damsel," said Lancelot, "if I do that for you, you may truly say that I do more for you than ever I have done for any lady. For never have I worn a token from any lady before this. But I will wear your token in my helmet right gladly." He thought to himself that thus he would indeed be well disguised at the tournament, for all the world knew that Lancelot had never worn a lady's favour. Then Elaine brought him a crimson scarf, richly sewn with pearls, and not for an instant during the evening did her eyes leave the face of this brave and handsome knight, who would wear her token in the tournament. The next morning Arthur and his knights departed from Astolat, and soon afterward Lancelot and Sir Lavaine followed them. When they arrived at Camelot, they went to the home of a rich citizen who was a friend of Sir Lavaine's father, and there they were lodged awaiting the tournament. Meanwhile, the city was filling with those who were to take part in and those who were to watch the tournament. Every house was filled. Rich tents and pavilions were pitched in the surrounding meadows. Everywhere swirled the motley crowd. From the upper windows, the milling, colorful streets looked like huge rainbows or mighty kaleidoscopes, ever changing, yet constantly bright. But when the great tournament began, these streets were deserted, and the whole bright throng was packed about the lists. A truly noble array of knights was lined up at each end of the lists, awaiting the signal from the heralds' trumpets. The King of the Scots, King Anguish of Ireland, the mighty Sir Palomides, Mordred, Kay, and Griflet, to mention but a few of the most famous, were on Arthur's side, while the King of Northgalis, the King with 100 knights, the King of Northumberland, and Sir Galahad were against the king. Apart, on the edge of the field, 2 silent figures sat their horses. Their shields were blank. No one might guess their names. One wore in his helmet a crimson scarf. Again and again Arthur's knights charged. Again and again his adversaries countercharged. Lance shivered upon shield, and shield clattered to earth. Down went horses and men, swords were drawn, and the din of steel on steel filled the air. Now one side, now the other was beaten back, only to rally and come on again with renewed vigor. Broken armor, shattered spears, shorn plumes littered the ground. The ranks of both sides thinned, and many a riderless horse galloped frantically among the fighters, adding to the confusion and uproar. But by and by, Arthur's knights began to beat back their opponents with the steady persistence that, to the trained eye of a soldier, told the ultimate defeat of Arthur's adversaries. When he saw this, the knight of the red scarf said to his companion, "It is our time. If you will help me a little, you will see the pursuers chased back as rapidly as they now come forward." "Sir," said his comrade, "spare not. I will do what I may." And with that, Sir Lancelot and Sir Lavaine rode into the thickest of the fight with such a mighty charge that Lancelot unhorsed 4 of Arthur's men before he broke his spear, and Sir Lavaine smote down 2. Seizing another lance, Lancelot unseated 5 men, and Lavaine hurled from their saddles another 2. Then Lancelot drew his sword and laid about him so vigorously that many other knights were soon on the ground, and Arthur's party withdrew to the end of the lists in confusion. "Indeed, this is a most marvellous knight," said Sir Gawain to Arthur, "and were it not for the scarf he wears in his helmet, I should think it was Lancelot, for no other knight did I ever see do such deeds at arms." "I know who he is," said the king. "We shall know him better before he leaves." By this time the king's forces had rallied, and heartily ashamed of their late reverse, they threw themselves upon their adversaries with renewed vigor, and specially they set upon the unknown knights. Then 3 set at once upon Lancelot, and Lancelot's horse was killed. A spear pierced Lancelot's shield and entered his side, the point breaking off in the wound. Lavaine, reckless with rage, threw himself upon the King of Scots, and knocking him from horse, brought the charger to Lancelot, and despite the assault of all Arthur's knights, helped his fallen chief to mount. A horse again, Lancelot, though sorely wounded, indeed fearing that he met his death, laid about him with so many mighty blows, and smote down a many a noble knight, so that ere the joust was ended, he had overcome more than 30 knights. And Sir Lavaine, on his part, did marvellously well, for he that day unhorsed 10 knights, and most of these were of the Round Table. Then the king caused the heralds to blow to lodgings, and after the trumpets had sounded, and the knights laid down their arms, the heralds came forward with the prize to bestow it upon the knight of the white shield and the red scarf, for as yet Lancelot was unknown to them. Then said Lancelot, "My lords, if I deserve thanks, I have bought it at a great price, for I am likely to lose my life through this adventure. I am sorely hurt, and beg your leave to depart, for I had now rather have rest than be lord of all the world." With that he wheeled his horse about, and followed by Sir Lavaine, rode hastily away from the lists. At last they came to a little wood, and there halted. Turning to Lavaine, Lancelot said weakly, I pray you to pull this spear from my side, for it galls me past all endurance." This Lavaine was loath to do, fearing that Lancelot would bleed to death. But as Lancelot urged, he at last seized the shattered lance, and with a great tug drew it from Lancelot's side. The wounded knight fainted. He remained in the swoon so long that Sir Lavaine feared that he was dead. But at last his eyes opened, and he begged his young friend to take him to a certain hermit not far away, who was a skilful physician. Presently they arrived at the hermitage, which was a large and comfortable house set in a pleasant wood, for the hermit was a rich knight who had renounced the world through piety. There they were courteously received, and though the patient was unknown, the hermit undertook to treat his wound. But when the wounded knight removed his helmet, his physician recognized him as Lancelot, and doubled his efforts to make him comfortable and to repair his hurt. While Lancelot lay at the hermit's forest retreat, Arthur and his knights were seeking him. All agreed that so great a knight should not have been permitted to go away in such a desperate plight as he had left the lists, and not a few hinted that he had been foully dealt with. All admired him, though none but Arthur knew his name, and even those who had fared worst at his hands in the tournament had nothing but praise for the brave and able knight. "By my head," exclaimed Sir Gawain, "I will find him." Forthwith he set out, accompanied by a squire, to scour the country. Into all the highways and byways about Camelot he went, and sought out all the retreats where a wounded man would be likely to go. Nowhere, however, could he find a trace of the knight of the red scarf. Then Arthur set out for London, and Sir Gawain set out on a longer search, more distant from Camelot. And so one evening he came to the castle of Sir Bernard, and sought shelter for the night. Of course it was readily given him, and news of the court, and especially of the tournament, was eagerly inquired for by his host. You may be sure that Lady Elaine had plenty of questions to ask about the jousts. There were 2 knights, answered Sir Gawain, who bore white shields, and one of them wore a red scarf upon his helmet, and certainly he was one of the best knights that ever I saw joust, for I dare say he smote down 40 of the knights of the Round Table. His companion did right well too, and perhaps saved his comrade's life. Then Elaine, in her innocence, frankly told Gawain the story of the knight of the red scarf, and how he had left his shield in her keeping, but had refused to tell them his name. "Show me the shield," said Gawain. So the shield was brought, and the case which covered it was pulled off. "Lancelot!" exclaimed Gawain, and in his turn he told how Lancelot had been wounded, and how he and his companion had ridden away, nobody knew where. And Elaine was very proud to know that her token had been worn by the knight of greatest prowess in the tournament, and that Sir Lancelot, who had never before worn a lady's token, had worn hers. Nevertheless, her tender heart was filled with sadness by the news of his hurt, and she pictured him to herself wandering wounded, perhaps dying, with only her brother for a companion, nobody knew where. "Father," she cried, "let me seek Sir Lancelot and my brother, for never can I be happy until I find them." Then her father fitted her out for travelling, and she set off, and by chance found her brother at Camelot, where he had gone to have his horse shod, and with him rode to the hermitage where Lancelot lay. Sir Lavaine led her to Lancelot's chamber, and when she saw him lying there so weak and pale, who late had been so strong and full of life, she fainted. The brave knight was deeply touched by her devotion. Calling her to him, he kissed her, and as she sat beside him, learned how she had found out who he was, and how she had sought him out. And the days passed happily for the wounded man, and for his devoted nurse. Elaine never left his side, and was ever eager to do what she might for his comfort. At last, Lancelot was fully recovered of his wound, and joyfully he rode beside Elaine and Lavaine to their father's house. Sir Bernard received them with great rejoicing, and there Lancelot remained a little while before returning to Arthur's court. But when he was about to leave, the lovely Lady Elaine came to him and begged him to take her with him. "Take me with you," she begged, "even as a servant, for I cannot live when you are far away from me." "That I cannot, fair maid," said Lancelot sadly, for his heart was deeply touched by her devotion. "Truly, I shall die if you leave me," pleaded Elaine, and despite Lancelot's attempts to comfort her, she burst into tears and, weeping softly, climbed the stairs to her chamber. From its window she watched the departing knight in whom her whole soul was wrapped up. Slowly his horse bore him along the road, which they had so joyfully ridden together a few days before. Smaller and smaller became his figure in the distance. At last it crossed a little hill, and was gone. But the Maid of Astolat gazed long from her window. The stars came out and faded, and still she remained looking toward Camelot, and dreaming of Lancelot. And when morning came, she lay down on her bed, and called for her father and her elder brother. "My heart is breaking," said she, "and I shall soon die. Let Sir Tirre write as I shall dictate, and let the writing be placed in my hand after I am dead. Then place my body on a barge draped in black, and put at the helm a trusted servant, and let the barge drift down the Thames to Westminster." Then she directed what her brother should write, and presently she died. Astolat and all the country round about was filled with sorrow by the death of this gentle lady, for her goodness was of equal fame with her beauty. Castle and peasant's hut were alike filled with grief, and willing hands hastened to prepare the funeral barge as Elaine had requested. They draped it with black satin, and with the flowers that Elaine had loved, and when it was done, they placed the body of the unhappy lady, clad in her richest robes, upon a rich bed covered with cloth of gold, in the midst of the barge. An old retainer of the family, clad in black too, took the long steering oar, and the peasants pushed the boat into the current of the Thames. Slowly it drifted down the stream, while the weeping friends of poor Elaine stood upon the bank and watched the receding barge until it had become a black speck on the shining river. Gaily passed the days at Westminster, where Arthur held his court. All the knights of the Round Table had gathered, and tales of adventure that they had experienced in their journeys entertained and thrilled the court. The great Lancelot, still shaken and weak from his wounds, the healing of which he had delayed by rash practice at arms before his side was fully knit, was there. His valorous conduct when, as a disguised knight, he had entered the great tournament was on every tongue. But his soul was heavy, for he thought often of the fair maid of Astolat, and his brave and gentle heart was grieved, because through him she had been brought to so great a sorrow. He pictured her mourning in her lonely chamber high over sleepy little Astolat, nursing a hopeless love. Truly, he would be glad to hear that she had found a new love, and he promised himself that if she did, he would dower her handsomely. But he was alone in his grief, and about him all was merriment, and the court echoed with light laughter. Now, one day as they were strolling by the Thames, 2 knights espied a black dot far up the river. Lazily it drifted toward them, well out in the middle of the stream, but as it approached Westminster and began to draw near the bank, the watchers saw that it was a barge, heavily draped with black satin, which trailed behind it in the water. In the stern stood an old man, bent over the long steering sweep. Wondering what this strange boat may mean, the knights followed it until it touched the river bank. No one alighted from it. No word could they get from the aged man at the oar. Cautiously they peeped through the curtains. There, upon a rich bed, they beheld the loveliest lady they had ever seen, clothed in rich robes and strewn with garlands. They turned away awestruck and hastened to the king. Quickly the gaiety of the court was turned to curiosity, and the curiosity to grief, as the knights related their story, and Arthur and his queen and all his courtiers hastened to the riverside. Arthur and Guinevere alone entered the barge, and found all as the knights had described it. Great was their sorrow, and gladly would they have learned who the fair girl was, and why she had been brought thus to Westminster. But the lone old helmsman only bowed speechless in grief over the handle of his oar. And then the queen espied a paper clasped in Elaine's hand. Arthur took it, and the whole train returned again to the court. There, before all the courtiers, Arthur broke the seal. Lancelot had come in, having heard of the king's errand with Sir Lavaine and others who had not been to the black barge. Slowly the king read, and as he read, all eyes were turned on Lancelot. For the paper told of poor Elaine's unreturned love for the great knight, and the heartbreak that had brought her death. And the great-hearted Lancelot buried his face in his hands and wept that such a fate should have befallen so fair a lady through him. Her brother, before the whole court, absolved Lancelot of any blame for her death, but this was small balm to the troubled heart of the generous knight. But in recompense for her devotion, a poor thing but all that he could do, he caused her to be richly buried at Westminster, and all the knights and ladies of the court attended poor Elaine's funeral mass. Then the black barge turned up the Thames, and the solitary boatman slowly rowed it back toward Astolat. Slowly, slowly, the black boat glided up the stream, until it was but a black speck on the shining water. So ends the tale of the Maid of Astolat. The passing of King Arthur. Great changes had taken place at King Arthur's court since the coming of Sir Galahad. The knights were all vowed now to search for the Holy Grail that had disappeared from the castle of King Pelles when Sir Galahad went away. Who had taken it, everybody asked, but no one could give a reply. Had it really been carried through the banqueting hall the night that Sir Galahad had taken his place upon the seat perilous? Or was it only a dream, a vision that the knights had seen? If it were a vision, would any of them see it again? They could not answer these questions, but one and all they sought for the shining cup during the rest of their lives. Joseph and the rich fisher had long ago passed away, you see, and perhaps they alone knew what the Holy Grail really was. The strange old minstrel with the 2 bright snakes around his neck knew just a little, but not everything. He wore the snakes to show that he belonged to the old order of bards, the men who were something like priests and who sang stories of great nations and greater kings. His song of the Holy Grail was written down in the little book that he must have found in Merlin's mysterious house, with the 70 windows and the 60 doors. For Merlin was one of those bards himself, and very likely wore bright snakes about his neck as he came and went at King Arthur's court, though we are not exactly told that he ever did. But then we are by no means told all that happened in those days, and if we were, perhaps we should not believe it. This we do know, however, that all the knights who searched for the lost Grail cup knew that they had no chance of finding it, or even catching a glimpse of it in a vision, unless they were thoroughly good and true and pure, and without reproach. So all of them tried hard to be so, and though none of them ever quite succeeded, the very trying made their lives beautiful, just as shining and beautiful as the silver armor they wore, and the spears and swords that they carried in their hands. They still met at the round table, still passed the cup of fellowship from hand to hand, but the king, as he sat among them, felt that he was growing old. His eyes were often heavy, and his feet and hands grew tired when he donned his shining armor and wielded his famous sword. And one day he was obliged to go into battle against an enemy when he was too weary to fight. He was struck down and wounded, and his faithful knights carried him to a quiet, grassy place in a meadow, near which rippled the shining waters of a great lake. King Arthur lay on the moss, with his fingers on the handle of his sword Excalibur, and his followers stood around him with sad faces, for they thought that death was about to take their beloved king. But he himself knew better. He smiled as he lay there, and his face was very bright. Lifting himself up a little, he looked toward the waters of the lake, and then he beckoned to a knight, who was called Sir Bedivere. "Take my sword, Excalibur," said the king. Throw it as far as you can fling it toward the center of the lake. Then come back and tell me what happens." Sir Bedivere took the sword and carried it to the edge of the lake. Night was falling, and the moon was brightening above the quiet hills. In the moonlight, the jewels in the handle of Excalibur looked very rich and beautiful, so rich and so beautiful that Sir Bedivere felt he could not bear to throw the sword into the water. He hid it among the forget-me-nots and the meadowsweet, and went empty-handed back to the king. "Did you throw the sword into the lake?" asked Arthur eagerly. "Yes, sire," answered Sir Bedivere boldly. "What happened?" "Nothing happened, sire." The king lay back again with a groan. "Faithless messenger," he said, "you have not thrown the sword. Go, do as I command you." Again Sir Bedivere went, but again the beauty of Excalibur overcame him. He returned to the king and declared that he had flung the sword into the water, but still nothing had happened. Arthur looked at him steadily, and his eyes made Sir Bedivere tremble. "You are not speaking the truth," cried the king. "Go, do as I command." His voice was very strong and stern, and at last Bedivere obeyed. Hurrying to the water's edge, he took Excalibur in his hand again, this time not daring to look at its beauty. The rubies and sapphires and diamonds of the handle flashed as he flung it far, far into the lake. Just as it was about to strike the water, a white hand and arm, clothed in a shining sleeve, rose above the ripples, and the outstretched fingers caught the sword. 3 times the hand waved Excalibur in the moonlight. Then arm and sword disappeared below the water, and all was still. Breathless and awed, Sir Bedivere went back to the king and told what he had seen. "It is well," said Arthur wearily. "Carry me to the lake." So his knights lifted him and carried him gently across the moonlit grass until they came to the water's edge. As they walked in slow procession, they saw a dim ship, like a dark barge, coming from the middle of the lake toward the bank. Many ladies, shadowy in the pale light, were seated in it, with their heads bowed upon their hands. All of them were hooded, and 3, who wore crowns upon their heads, looked like queens. Then the king bade the knights lay him in the barge, and they did so, and gave him into the care of the 3 queens. So to the barge they came. There those 3 queens put forth their hands, and took the king, and wept. Down from the hills swept a great wind, and it seemed as if the sound of sobbing and wailing was in its cold breath. The clouds rushed across the moon, and the water of the lake looked black and terrible as the barge began to move away from the land. The knights stood upon the bank and watched as if they were in a dream. Then, even as they watched, the darkness went away. Far, far off, right away as it were, beyond the mirror, little shining islands began to show, bright and beautiful, and for all the world like sunset clouds. All the knights had heard of these islands, and knew that they were called the Isles of the Blessed. In the very center of them was one named Avalon, the fairest of them all. Its valleys were fragrant with flowers, and in its orchard grew trees that bore golden apples. It seemed to the knights that the barge with the 3 fairy queens and the weary human king sailed right up to the shores of Avalon, and that a number of bright and beautiful people came to meet it. Then from the dawn it seemed there came, but faint, as from beyond the limit of the world, like the last echo born of a great cry, sounds, as if some fair city were one voice around a king returning from his wars. Then the whole vision faded. Nothing was left but the lake and the moonlit meadows and the memory of the great and only King of the Round Table. But some people say that Arthur lives and is happy in Avalon to this day, and that there he has met Joseph and the rich fisher and his old wise teacher Merlin, the great magician. They say, too, that it is in Avalon that the silver table is hidden, on which stands the shining cup, and that there, every evening, is held the mysterious feast which fills all the guests with joy and amazement, just as they were filled with joy and amazement hundreds of years ago, on that Christmas day when Joseph's staff broke into blossom at Glastonbury. The end. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we begin a new book. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.